So in today's video, we're going to talk about a common debate in the retro gaming community as to whether or not you are still having the full game experience of a classic game if you're using an emulator, as opposed to going out and getting the original hardware and playing the game on its original cartridge or disc or whatever, and maybe even going as far as to play it on an old TV, like get a TV from the 1980s and play the NES that way, or even like an early 2000s TV to play the PlayStation 2. I know there are a lot of people that have setups like that, and they consider it like the real experience and the only true way to play these old games. I would say there are three main advantages that playing via emulation has over original hardware, and also three advantages that playing on original hardware has over playing a game via emulation. Definitely the biggest advantage that emulation has is accessibility. With original hardware, you have to get access to the original hardware, which is not always easy. Some of them cost a lot of money to get on eBay, and it's not even guaranteed that it's like a fully functional console, and it can easily break down because it's old. And old hardware, old technology is not reliable and is not easy to maintain. But with emulation, it allows gamers to play titles on modern hardware, modern devices, often with enhanced features like higher resolutions, smoother frame rates, and save states. This accessibility is particularly valuable for those who may not have access or cannot afford original hardware. Maybe the console itself isn't very expensive, but the cartridges certainly can be. Zelda Ocarina of Time, for example, costs about $60 on eBay, and if you're trying to build up a whole game collection for some of these consoles, it's going to be very, very expensive. But with emulation, obviously the cost is nothing. And you can get into conversation about the ethics of downloading free ROMs as opposed to actually paying for these games, but it's definitely more of a moral gray area when it comes to classic retro games. A new study came out this summer saying that about 87% of classic video games are not being sold and distributed on modern gaming platforms. And a classic video game in this study is defined as a video game released before the year 2010. 87% of all games released before 2010 you can only get either through purchasing the original hardware and the original cartridges or by emulating, which, yes, in a lot of cases is piracy. But the alternative is to shell out thousands upon thousands of dollars to build up your game library for these 20, 30, 40-year-old games that may not even be durable and may break down also. Like, the supply is going to get lower and lower and lower and lower and lower as time goes on. So, in the long term, just going on eBay and buying these cartridges and buying these old consoles is not sustainable. So the second main advantage that emulation has over original hardware is definitely game preservation. Emulation plays a crucial role in preserving these older games and making sure they don't just get lost in time. As original hardware becomes increasingly scarce and prone to failure, emulation ensures that these classic titles remain accessible to future generations. So those 2 points kind of go hand in hand, accessibility and game preservation, but in more of an artistic sense, game preservation is an important thing because whether a game is good or bad, and there have been plenty of bad games released over the years, it's still important that they're preserved throughout history and people can experience them still. So emulation is vital when it comes to game preservation. Whether you are or are not a fan of emulating, it's just objectively a positive thing for everybody that plays video games and wants these games to be preserved. And the third big advantage that emulation has over original hardware is just overall customization. Emulators often provide a range of customization options, enabling players to tweak graphic settings, use cheat codes, and even apply mods or patches to enhance the gaming experience. There are so many games that just look better, play better, run better, because of the existence of these emulators, like with a lot of these PS3 games that are now being emulated via RPCS3. On the original hardware, these games were locked at 30 frames per second, but if, assuming you have a powerful enough computer, you can unlock the frame rate and go to 60 FPS or sometimes even beyond that. And it just looks and runs so much better and is a much better experience, actually, than playing it on an actual PS3. And some of these texture mods and graphic mods that have been coming out on Dolphin and other emulators where these old games just look so great, like they look like modern releases. The freedom and customization that the PC platform offers extends to all of the platforms that are being emulated on PC, and it's as if the game has an official PC version. It's great. With that being said, there are advantages to playing a game on the original hardware that they're worth mentioning. Emulation is not perfect, and it is not always going to give you a better gameplay experience depending on the platform and depending on the game. Not every game can simply be emulated, especially the more modern games with the modern emulators like the Wii U emulator and the PS3 and 360 emulators. Still a long way to go. Like, when we're talking about that platform, on average, it is definitely better to play on the original platform. But I would say the one big advantage that original hardware has over emulation is authenticity. Playing on original hardware offers an authentic experience as it replicates the conditions in which the game was originally designed to be played. This includes the feel of the original controller, the nuances of the sound and graphics, and the overall ambiance of the gaming environment. When you're playing on an old analog TV for your NES or your Super Nintendo or your N64, it's a lot different than playing it on a PC with modern controls and a modern display. Like, it's a different feel. And honestly, for some platforms, emulation just straight up doesn't work for me. And it's not as functional and enjoyable as playing on the original platform. I think the Nintendo DS, for me, would be the biggest example of that. Because most of the games on that platform are made for touchscreen controls, and trying to, you can click it with your mouse or whatever, but it just feels awkward. And with a lot of these platforms, like the Nintendo DS and the 3DS, PlayStation Portable, PlayStation Vita, Wii U, you don't necessarily need to be emulating in order to be able to modify your gaming experience, because all these platforms are relatively easy to mod and to customize things, and pretty much having most of the benefits of emulating when it comes to customizing stuff and homebrew, but you're still on the original hardware, and you can still maintain that original authentic experience that you want. And you can also download ROMs, so the whole idea of emulation being a benefit because you can just download all these games for free, well, you can still do that on the original hardware with a lot of these platforms. But obviously, just getting the emulator in most cases is much, much, much easier than trying to modify the original hardware. But yeah, with authenticity, as far as that's concerned, it just feels more like the game was meant to be played. And, I've noticed a lot of times when I'm playing, for example, games on the PS2 emulator, that there's, a slight input delay when I use my wireless Xbox controller, and it just doesn't feel like, it just feels off sometimes, So while emulation is vital when it comes to preserving a lot of games, one could argue that true preservation lies within the original gameplay experience and not trying to replicate it on PC with emulation. For many gamers, going back and playing these old games, it's about reliving the nostalgia associated with the time when the game was first released. The sights and sounds and smells even of the original console, it contributes significantly to the emotional connection that players have with the game. So when you're, trying to replay it on PC, it's not exactly the same, but it is exactly the same if you actually go back and play the exact same console that the game was made for. So if you care about authenticity and you want a true nostalgic experience, those are two big advantages that original hardware experience will have over an emulator. And I would say the third big advantage that it has, if you're interested in investing and making money, retro game collection could be very lucrative over time, because the older these consoles and games get, the more valuable they become. And a lot of people are willing to shell out tons of money in order to get these games and consoles. So if you have them, you can potentially get a big return on your investment. It'll obviously take a lot of time, but in 10 or 20 years, it's going to be a lot more valuable than it is today. Even with emulation, people are still wanting to buy the original thing. And you may not even just be interested in the money aspect of collecting all these games and consoles. You just might be a hobbyist that likes collecting. There are people who collect quarters and people who collect baseball cards. Your thing might just be to collect these physical games. I mean, that's a big reason why there is still some form of a physical market in 2023 for modern video game consoles, because people just like physically having the game in their hands and to collect the discs and the cartridges. So if that's something that's very important to you, it's not going to really feel very satisfying when you just have a bunch of ROM files on your PC. But it doesn't truly matter how you play. Whatever makes you happy is fine. I personally prefer emulation because I think the benefits of greater accessibility, better customization, and better game preservation, I find those three things very valuable, and I just find the benefits of original hardware to be more on the arbitrary level. Like, if it's something that you value, then fine. But I find that there are a lot of people that play, like, that they spend all this money on these retro consoles and retro games, and they kind of develop a little bit of a superiority complex over people who just use the emulators. They're like, oh, look at how much money I spend, look how much better I am, and look, I have the real thing, and you just have this fake emulated shit. That's something you hear very often. It's just anything where people spend a shit ton of money on something. Even PC gamers are guilty of that, and people who, like, have the best GPU and best CPU, and when talking about emulations, like, oh, look, I can run these PS3 games at 1440p, 120 frames, and I'm better than you. Like, people do it all the time. It's not me trying to knock on the retro game community specifically. Most of them are really cool people, but I have noticed a lot of gatekeeping and a little bit of a negative stigma towards people who use emulators and don't play on the original systems. At the end of the day, it all comes down to your personal preference and what you value in your gaming experience, and this debate ultimately comes down to striking a balance between convenience and authenticity. Which do you value more is going to determine which position that you would take on emulation versus original hardware. But I think there should be a common understanding among all of us that the most important aspect here is the enjoyment derived from playing the game, regardless of how you actually play it.